Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third and final working day of our conference, and my great pleasure to announce our opening keynote speaker for today. Professor Kalliopi Bourdara is a Professor Emerita of the National and Kapodistrian University at Athens. She's a professor of law, of legal history, and she specializes in many subjects, including Byzantine law that she will be talking about today. She's also, I think, the director of the Nikos Forounos Institute. She has had a very rich academic and, to a degree, political career that Professor Avramovich has mentioned at the opening. And she is also a great friend of our faculty and our university. She has been here a number of times. Then we had a break due to COVID, but fortunately, we are all here again in person for another and hopefully not for the last time. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for everything you said, more than it is in reality. I always remember Professor Avramovich and the courses we had together, and also the academy and Mr. Pivatic, of course, Lyuba Maximovich. Today, we shall speak about a subject that I like very much, is the crime of laesae majestatis, a crime I have worked very much on it, and of course it is a huge subject, but today we shall have a small overview of all this. The texts of the Byzantine literature give elements for the political theory of the Byzantines. After studying these texts, we can conclude which were the qualities that a Byzantine should have in order to become and remain emperor. In Byzantium, the reign, the monarchy, was not hereditary. This means that everyone could claim the throne despite of origin or sex. A classic example is Emperor Basil I in the 9th century, an illiterate peasant who came from the region of Thrace. He left his village and went to Constantinople to find a better future, a better way of life. Finally, he managed, using several legal and illegal ways, to slip into the palace. The last act was to plot against the Emperor Michael III, the last representative of the dynasty of Amorium, to murder him in 867 and to climb in this way to the throne. It seems that Basil had many qualities, many capacities, and he became a powerful emperor. Using the system of co-emperors, he founded a dynasty, the so-called Macedonian dynasty, the most powerful, brilliant dynasty of mid-Byzantium. Women, we have spoken yesterday also about women, could also become emperors, not as wives or mothers of an emperor, but in their own, by themselves. A typical example is Irene the Athenian. She became empress as the wife of Leo IV, and after his death, she ruled together with her son Constantine VI. After the blindness of her son in 797, she became, until 802, sole emperor. That is, she ruled, she practiced, she exercised the authority on her sole name. She promulgated laws, she cut money. Irene, according to her legislation, that is according to the official text, called herself king, not queen. Irene eleo Theou Vasilevs, and not Vasilissa. We can explain it. The normal situation was that a man and not a woman sat on the Byzantine throne. The case of Zoe and Theodora in the 11th century is a little different. They were fit to become emperors because they were the last descendants of the Macedonian dynasty, and in the mind of the people, they had the legitimation to rule. Anyway, theoretically, women were also fit to become emperors, as long as they had the same capacities with men. But in any case, a woman on the throne was not something accustomed. We may say that it was the great exception, not the rule. As a jurist, I shall make reference to the legal texts, which constitute the official expression to find out the qualities, the capacities that a Byzantine should have in order to become and remain emperor. It is well known that constitution, as we know it in modern states, did not exist in Byzantium. That is, in the Byzantine state, a law with increased typical validity as it exists in nowadays countries did not exist. Not even constitutional clauses spread in various other laws existed. Only a legislative text of the 9th century, the Εισαγωγή or Επαναγωγή, promulgated in 885-886, has such clauses. Its first chapters constitute a kind of constitutional clauses. They determine separately the responsibilities of the temporal authority and separately those of the ecclesiastical authority. In the same legal text, there are also clauses concerning the administration of the state. These clauses were written by the hand of the great Patriarch Photius, who was also a very good jurist. The title of the first chapter is Περί νόμου και δικαιοσύνης, that is, about law and justice. The second is Περί βασιλέως, that is, about the emperor. It mentions the qualities, the capacities, the characteristics that somebody should have to become and remain emperor. According to the first clause, the emperor should be good towards all his subjects. He should act impartially. This means that he did not make good and he did not punish anyone according to his feelings, but objectively. The aim of the emperor was to assure decently whatever exists in the state, to watch over and take back anything lost. He must act and recover everything with wisdom. The emperor should be a pious Orthodox. In this sense, he should keep all the commands of the Holy Scriptures and the decisions of the 7 ecumenical synods. He should be benefactor, keep the laws, interpret the old legislation, and complete anything lacking by its similar. He must have in mind and remember the laws of the city when he makes interpretation of the laws. This interpretation must be done with goodwill. When there is doubt, he must prefer to give the most friendly to the people interpretation. If there is not written law for some cases, he must keep and apply the customs. In the case that even customs do not exist, he must apply those laws which are nearer to the demanded case. If the law has an evident interpretation, he must not alter it. Also, he must not introduce elements that laws do not provide. In the same title, the Εισαγωγή Επαναγωγή reminds that law is written. It can be abolished only by written law or by disuse of the law. Sometimes there is doubt about the customs. In this case, customs can be applied only if the court confirms them as still existing. All customs that have long-lasting application produce the effect of written law. So we can conclude that according to the law, that is the mentioned clauses of the Εισαγωγή Επαναγωγή, the Byzantine emperor should be wise, pious, respect the laws, not change the law arbitrarily, give the good example to everybody and for everything, big or small, reward the just, the fair persons, and punish the unfair, the unjust. The concept in general was that the emperor should behave as a real father. He should defend the state from the enemies, establish the peace, take back the lost regions, and protect every region of the country in such a way that it will not be lost. If the emperor acted according to the above mentioned, rules, he was fit to be and remain a sovereign, safe on his throne and protected by God. That's why, according to Emperor Constantine IX Monomachus, middle of the 11th century, he did not need to have security, to have gods. He was o perifrurumenos tes tu Theou palames. He was protected by the palms of God. According to this concept, Constantine IX did not take care for his personal security. If anybody tried to persuade him to take measures of security, he laughed at him, sent him away os noson peritotheon τους λογισμούς, as if he was ill in mind about the divine. He said that only God watched over him, and since he had the most perfect God, he did not need a human one which was imperfect. Surely Constantine IX was an exception. All Byzantine emperors had their personal god, their bodyguard. According to the Byzantine political theory, God chose the person who would become emperor. He should have the mentioned qualities. So the person fit to become emperor, governed by divine will, and he could be overthrown again by divine will. How could this happen? Usually, when he lost the mentioned qualities and thus became unfit to be at the head of the state, to be on the imperial throne, if namely the economia of the emperor did not function in a satisfactory way, anymore God would decide that he would not be emperor anymore. This change, which appeared as ataxia, as disorder, justified the violent overthrow of an emperor. Some examples: the overthrow of Emperor Phocas in the 7th century, or the overthrow of Andronikos Komnenos in the 12th century in 1185. But none of the subjects was allowed to act against the emperor. If he acted in this way, he insulted the choice of God, since this person chosen by God had and kept the above mentioned characteristics. Every act against the emperor was considered as an act of the enemies of God and the faith. This act against the fit emperor was called kathosíosis, laesae majestatis, and it was a crime, the crime of laesae majestatis, to έγκλημα καθοσιώσεως. According to the Byzantine legislation, special law existed for this crime and provided penalties against those who committed this crime. So, according to the Pandex 48.4.3 and 49.16, the Ecloga 17.3, the Basilica 60.51.34, the penalty was the capital, that is death, and periorismos deportatio, the so-called heavy exile. This kind of exile was the banishment, the deportation of the condemned person to an island, followed by the loss of citizenship and his fortune, that is a tacit or implicit confiscation. Periorismos deportatio was similar to death, a civil death. The emperor or the imperial court, competent for the trials of crimes of laesae majestatis, imposed the penalties. So, what happened in practice? Literary sources give information on this subject. Usually, according to the policy that each emperor followed, the imposed penalties were milder, that is, not death or deportatio, but others. One of the milder penalties usually imposed to those who had committed this crime or were considered as guilty was, as we said yesterday, blindness and, in general, mutilation, that is, the cutting off members of the body. Legislation does not mention the blindness as penalty imposed to persons condemned for crime of laesae majestatis. The Ecloga, the legislation text of the Isaurian emperors Leo III and his son Constantine V, promulgated in 741 during the iconoclasm, mentions this penalty. It is important to those who had it is imposed to those who had committed the crime of sacrilege, and especially the so-called heavy grave sacrilege. Thus, it was imposed to those who entered the altar either during daytime or at night and took off, stole sacred vessels. The Basilica 60.36.1 refers that operiton epivulon nomos, homios esti to perieros ilias, that is, the law referring to the incendius is the same as the law referring to sacrilege. The comment that follows explains, clarifies that the reference does not concern the penalties of sacrilege, but the acts, the sacrilegious acts against the sacred. So the person who thinks, organizes, makes an attempt against the emperor, he acts against the sacred person. According to this interpretation, these two crimes resemble very much because public things or persons are alike the sacred ones. So, as long as the law concerning the insidious is alike the law concerning the sacrilege, the penalty should be also the same, that is, blindness. So, after and according to the comments of the clause of the Basilica 60.36.1, the penalty of blindness was imposed customarily to the guilty of crime of laesae majestatis. Eastern peoples, and mainly the Persians, and used the blindness as penalty. Byzantine writers refer that the Persians imposed this sentence mainly to those who wanted to ascend the throne. Blinding was the way to make them incapable to become emperors. It was the way to make them harmless, unable, unfit to become kings. The Persians considered that blindness, even of the one eye, was an insurmountable obstacle for anyone to climb the throne. In Byzantium existed an informal, a customary rule that a disabled person was not fit to become emperor. In consequence, a blind person could not reign, so blindness put aside every dangerous competitor of the throne. In any case, blindness was a more indulgent penalty than the elimination of life that the Byzantine legislation threatened. That's why the emperor should give an order, written or oral, or his consent for its implication. There were also some consequences after the execution of blindness, and there were that the blind person deducted from the dignities he had. He lost them, and his property was usually confiscated. The Byzantine literary sources give many examples of blindness, mainly of the powerful opponents of the emperor. The first blindness imposed as penalty to those who had turned against the royal authority is referred in 705. At that time, Emperor Justinian II blinded the Patriarch Kallinikos, who was accused that he defamed the emperor during the rebellion of Leontius. I shall mention some examples of blindness of the Middle Byzantine period. During the reign of the Isaurian emperors, blindness had become a general measure. Moreover, the legislation of the same emperors imposed mutilations as penalty in many cases. That is, they replaced the penalty of death with mutilations. They considered that it was more indulgent, and it was. The condemned did not lose his life, he remained alive. Emperor Constantine V, at the beginning of his reign in 743, blinded his great opponent Artavasdos, his sons and his cousin Sicinius, patrician and general of the Thracians, who had turned against him. In this way, they became harmless, they could not claim any more the kingship, and stopped to be a threat for Constantine. During the reign of Constantine VI and his mother, Irene the Athenian, Caesar Nikephoros was blinded. Nikephoros was brother of the late Emperor Constantine V, the grandfather of Constantine VI, and uncle of his father, Leo IV. He was a permanent source of instability as a claimant to the throne with many followers. It is considered, according to some sources, that Irene the Athenian ordered in 797 the blindness of her own son and Emperor Constantine VI. After that, she became sole emperor. During the reign of Emperor Nikephoros I, the general of the East, Vardanios, made a revolution against the emperor. He was acclaimed emperor and began his march towards Constantinople. In the meantime, the two opponents had some diplomatic discussions, but without results. Finally, Vardanios was blinded, and thus the powerful opponent of Nikephoros became harmless. The Emperor Leo V felt insecure. He was afraid that the archontes, the dignitaries and the officials in general, conspired against him in order to overthrow him. His main arm against them was the accusation, true or not, of conspiracy. He blinded everybody that he suspected, and so he weakened him and his collaborators. Emperor Basil I, who was born in a village of Thrace, as I have mentioned, and lived there. When he became a young man, he left his village and went to Constantinople. He succeeded to become emperor using many ways and methods, legal, illegal, and immoral. According to the sources, many important officials doubted his authority. For example, Leo Apostipis in 880 and Kourkouas, member of the well-known Byzantine family of the Kourkouas, in 886. Both were blinded. The son of Basil I, Leo, the later on Emperor Leo VI the Wise, was accused that he organized a conspiracy against his own father in order to overthrow him. Some close friends of the emperor urged him to blind Leo. In this way, Leo would become harmless and unfit to become emperor. But Patriarch Phorcys, who was Leo's teacher, impeded him, and so Leo was saved. In the 10th century, members of the big, powerful families, the magnates of the eastern part of the empire, reacted and made attempts to overthrow the emperors. These attempts were realized when the emperor was weak, not powerful for many reasons. For example, the age, minority, very young or old, internal problems of the imperial family, problems in the exercise of authority, and so on. In the year 919, Romanos Lakapinos was nominated Vasileopator. He became very powerful. In the same year, 919, Leo Phocas reacted against him. He belonged to the well-known and very powerful family of the East, the Phocas. Leo was arrested and blinded. Romanos Lakapinos became emperor in 920. In 923, there was a big revolt, a rebellion in the area of Chaldea against him. After its suppression, he gave the order to blind the most important of the rebels. In this way, all of them became harmless. The ways and the facts that John Themistis used to become emperor are well known. Members of the family of Phocas, relatives of the murdered emperor Nikephoros Phocas, acted against Themistis. He caught them and blinded them all. Constantine VIII was co-emperor with his brother Basil II, the powerful man, as we all know, who exercised indeed the authority, was Basil. After Basil's death in 1025, Constantine became sole emperor at the age of 70, that is, old for that time. He reigned 3 years, 1025 until 1028. During his reign, he suspected everybody. He blinded anybody only with the suspicion that he had in view the throne. This, for example, happened in 1025 with Constantine Votis and Nikephoros Komnenos, in 1026 with Vardas Phocas. In the same year, he blinded also Basil Skleros, member of the big, powerful family of the East, the Scleri. He blinded also Romanos Kourkouas, Lavas, and Goudelis as participants in the conspiracy of Basil Skleros. All these persons who suffered blindness were members of powerful families. In this way, they became harmless. Thus, blinding his opponents, Emperor Constantine VIII calmed down and made harmless the members of the powerful and dangerous families, mainly of the eastern part of the empire, representatives of which were the above-mentioned persons. In 1040, during the reign of Michael IV, Michael Cabras, Theodosius Messanictis, and many other military officials suffered blindness. They had plotted not against the emperor, but against his powerful brother, the Grand Domesticus and Eunuch Constantine, who was the real powerful person of the empire. But he could not become emperor as an eunuch, and so he had made emperors his brother and then his nephew. Michael V Calaphatis exiled the Porphyrogenity Empress Zoe. The people of Constantinople rose up and asked that the two Porphyrogenity, Zoe and Theodora, daughters of the last emperor of the Macedonian dynasty, should return to the palace and to the throne. As soon as Theodora returned, she dismissed Michael V from the palace. Finally, in 1042, she gave the order to blind Michael and his powerful uncle Constantine. In 1047, Leotornicius and Vatatzis, representatives of powerful families, revolted against the Emperor Constantine IX, the Monomachus. The emperor ordered to blind them. In 1071, during the Battle of Manzikert, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured by the Seljuks. Then in Constantinople, the Doukas family, that is John Doukas, his son, and young Michael Doukas, who was co-emperor, organized a plot. The aim was to overthrow Romanos Diogenes and to proclaim sole emperor Michael Doukas. The Seljuk Sultan set free Romanos Diogenes, who marched towards Constantinople. During his way to the reigning city, the Vasilevousa, according to an order given from Constantinople, he was caught by Byzantine soldiers and blinded. Until 1081, date of the accession on the throne of Alexius Komnenos, there was an irregular period. Emperors interchanged in short periods. During this period, Nikephoros Votaniatis, who became one of these emperors, blinded his co-rebel Vrienius and also Vasilicius. During the reign of Manuel Komnenos, 1143-1180, Theodoros Dipiotis was blinded. In 1175, some militaries disobeyed to the imperial orders. The result was that they suffered blindness. During the difficult, abnormal, and turbulent period of the reign of Andronikos Komnenos, blindness was an almost everyday act. Andronikos imposed blindness without restrictions, distinctions, and limitations to rebels, to those who were only suspicious, and in general to everybody he considered as an opponent. Even women suffered blindness. Isakios II Angelos became known, according to the sources, as another Andronikos, or Alos Andronikos. He blinded the son of Andronikos Komnenos, who had obviously laid down the arms, and his brother Manuel. He also blinded Andronikos Komnenos, grandson of Anna Komneni and of Caesar Vrienius. He blinded many others, among them Vasilios Kotsas, Statikios, Aspiotis, the Duke of the Fleet, Constantine, another one who belonged to the Komneni family, and others. That is, he wanted to exterminate the Komneni family. Isakios II was overthrown in 1195 by his brother Alexius, who became emperor as Alexius III Angelos. Isakios was blinded, but as we heard yesterday afternoon, he is the unique case that a blind person became emperor again. He managed to return to the throne, but how? With the help of the Latins. His son became co-emperor as Alexius IV. This is perhaps the only explanation how a blind Isakios turned back to the throne. He was not alone, and his son managed the situation and had the authority and manage the authority. This is a problem explanation. There were some examples from the Middle. These were some examples from the Middle Byzantine period. We can conclude that blindness was imposed to dignitaries, officials, and offsprings of big power families, mainly of the eastern part of the empire. These had the possibility, the strength to overthrow the emperor and take his place. Thus, they became unfit to become emperors. In any case, the invalid, the disabled by any mutilation, was unfit to become emperor. That's why mutilation, cutting off legs, arms, etc., was a usual punishment. The ecloga replaced in many cases the penalty of death and ordered instead of death mutilation. The unable person could not claim the throne. He became harmless. This was the reason that penalties of mutilation were imposed to the children of the rebel and to his collaborators, who were usually supreme officials. Another penalty that was imposed a few times according to the sources was the castration. The castrated persons were considered disabled and could not become emperors. But was the castration indeed a penalty? The legal texts do not give such information that castration was a penalty, especially for those who had committed the crime of laesae majestatis. On the other hand, according to Justinian's novel 142.1, castration was a crime, a criminal act. The penalty imposed to the guilty of such crime was castration. This is a case of tautopathia, identopathy. We know that Byzantine law, temporal and ecclesiastical, anticipates tautopathia expressly for those who made calumnies, the detractors and slanderers. In the case of crime of laesae majestatis, castration, considered as a case of mutilation, was a preventive measure imposed mainly to members of the overthrown imperial family. In this way, they became harmless. An example: Nikitas, son of the overthrown emperor Michael Rangavi in 813, who had distinguished military qualities and the army loved him, was castrated. After that, he had a brilliant ecclesiastical career. He became patriarch, the famous austere patriarch Ignatius of the 9th century. If he was not castrated, he could perhaps have become a very good emperor. Another example is the castration of the sons of Leo II. One of them died during the process of castration. Another example is in 913, after the death of Leo VI, the Wise, his brother, Emperor Alexander, took the decision that everything related to Leo should disappear. That is, he applicated in mid-Byzantium a kind of the Roman institution of damnatio memoriae. So he wanted to castrate his nephew Constantine, son of Leo, the afterwards famous Constantine VII, the Porphyrogentus. Constantine survived after the intervention of some friends of his father. The same happened with Stephen Doukas, son of Constantine Doukas, who in 913 tried to become emperor. After the death of Alexander, he had organized a big rebellion against Constantine VII. His son was castrated. Another measure, another kind of penalty imposed to a conspirator or rebel was to send him to a monastery and become monk. In this way, he became harmless. Many times, the overthrown emperor and members of his family became either by force or by their own will monks. For example, the overthrown Theodosius and his sons in 717, Michael Rangavis and his sons in 813. During the rebellion of Constantine Doukas in 913, his father-in-law and other officials were caught. They sent them to the famous monastery of Studion, and they became monks by force. Some emperors asked the help of the church in order to eliminate their opponents. A novel of Emperor Constantine VIII, promulgated in 1026, determined a spiritual penalty for the rebels. This novel was also signed by the Patriarch and the Synod. That's why it is called Tomos. According to this novel, all those who organized a conspiracy against the emperor and tried to overthrow him should be excommunicated. The same spiritual penalty should also be applied to their accomplices and, in general, all their collaborators. We do not know how long this Tomos was in force. A comment of Valsamon on the third canon of the Synod of Rangra refers that this Tomos was not in force anymore in the 12th century. In 1171, Emperor Manuel Komnenos promulgated another similar Tomos. According to its text, all conspirators, rebels, and their collaborators who in the future would act against his son Alexius would be excommunicated. We notice that this was not a general law as the previous one, but a special one, referring only to the reign of Manuel and his son. Manuel Komnenos wanted a spiritual penalty for those who would harm his son. The new Tomos of Manuel Komnenos shows that the Tomos of 1026 was not in force anymore. Patriarch Philotheos, in a dissertation, explains, according to the aims of the Church, why this Tomos was inoperative. So the Church reacted to this excommunication to the rebels. But when emperors were anxious for the future of their dynasty or did not trust their entourage, they asked the help of the Church. Manuel Komnenos was anxious for the future of the Komnenid dynasty, and as the facts proves, he was right. During the minority of his successor, a civil war burst out. Alexius II had bad end, and the Komneni dynasty died out 5 years after Manuel's death. The Tommy of excommunication could not stop the facts and the future of the empire. But why emperors wanted the excommunication of the rebels and of their opponents in general? The emperor, as I have already mentioned, should be a pious, a devout Orthodox Christian, somebody who was condemned by the Church to a spiritual penalty, and especially the excommunication could not become an emperor. Thus, the excommunicated opponent was eliminated and unfit to be emperor. Did finally the Church get involved in order to indicate or to stop somebody to become emperor? We have some examples, according to literature sources, that the Church interfered. So, in 969, Patriarch Polyeptos did not accept to crown John Zimistis. The late Emperor Nikephoros Phokas, a pious emperor, was murdered, and according to the rumors and also the sayings of some members of the palace, it was Zimistis himself who had murdered him. So Patriarch Polyeptos said that if Zimistis had himself, by his own hand, murdered Nikephoros Phokas, he would not crown him. The Patriarch said that if he had committed homicide, he was unfit to become emperor. No legal clause provides this case. Also, the Byzantine political theory does not make such reference. It was a moral case, and at the same time, Patriarch Polyeptos set a rule. A murderer was unfit to become emperor. The Patriarch withdrew when they proved, and he accepted that Zimistis was not perpetrator. After that, he accepted and crowned him. Dear colleagues, these were some results for those who committed or were accused for crime of laesae majestatis, who wanted to become emperors, and finally they made them unfit to become. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bourdara. Do we have any questions?
Well, thank you very much for this indeed brilliant speech. I would like to pose two questions. First, one, it considers the right of anybody to become emperor. It implies that he should have Roman citizenship. I mean, it is implied because it is not written anywhere, or it was. This is my first question. So it was a prerequisite for a Roman emperor to be Roman. But was it written or not? And the second is concerning the punishment of blinding. Professor Scheiner criticized the sources who perhaps or not exaggerates the number of blinded Bulgarians in 1014. The numbers are 15,000 and 14,000. But in this case, in my question, regarding my question, the number is not important, but the fact that they were blinded. They could not have been blinded if they were not subject of the emperor, theoretically. Was that right for? Okay. So this was my second question.
Thank you, Professor Kirimatic. You are right. We have no legal texts or clauses that say that the emperor must be a Roman citizenship. But what do we mean in Byzantium citizenship?
You mentioned the possibility of losing citizenship as a punishment, as a part of punishment.
Yes, why? Because this was a clause of the Roman legal system. It was a deminutio. And so they have taken this and they have in the Savoy. The same happens when I read that he must have the laws of the city. It's not the laws of the city. It was the law of the Roman city at the time, the Roman law. But it is transferred in Byzantine law as laws of the city. That is laws of the state anymore. This is what we have from Roman law to Byzantine law. So it is transferred like this, and they have not changed anything. So he must be an inhabitant of the Byzantine state and a subject of the Byzantine state. He could become an emperor. So this is the citizenship. As for the blindness of the Bulgarians, of course, the emperor thought and had his citizenships. His citizens, he follows the Bulgars, and he posed the blindness because he thought that this was a resurrection, a rebellion against him. And he blinded them, except one, from the one eye.
Yes, in 100. Each
by hundreds.
By 100. Yeah. Excuse me, I wouldn't like to speak too much because I will have my text and speech later on. But let me remind all of you that the excuse for this conference was the political career of Stefan Dechansky, who came to power in 1322 after a miraculous healing, but he was previously blinded in Serbian. For the first and the only time at the Serbian court. Yes, it's a very interesting question. So it means that perhaps unilaterally and without any legal base, this punishment was applied, because otherwise, well, we have to research. I mean, as far as I know, nobody researched the legal base for the punishment of Stefan Dechansky. Of course, we may try to find some reasons in the close connections of the two courts, and perhaps in a theoretical conception that that Milutin, the father of Stefan, as a son-in-law of the ruling emperor, was a part of the ruling family, and so on and so on. But still,
it is very interesting that only one blindness happened.
only one.
Is it good? So, thank you very much, Professor Bourdara, for this really excellent lecture, and it was really wonderful to have joining this up with our examples we brought yesterday, because it did fit exactly. And I was just wondering, because you've mentioned, of course, you've mentioned the example of Zoe and her sister being expelled through Michael Kalliopi. And there I remember an article by Ernst Gamilschek who analyzed the sources related to this, and they Michael Kalliopi said it was a Crimen laesae majestatis, which Zoe would have done. But the sources said this was not, of course, this was not true, but there was also some voices saying that Michael Kalliopi not even had the right, the legal right, to put this in the room. And so this was the reason for the riot in the population of the capital, for bringing her and her sister back. Do you know a little more about this? In fact, this was the Crimen laesae majestatis, and this form of accusation was not even legally confirmed.
Yes, we don't know, because these are historians write these things. We have no any thing that says that Kalliopi had done a crime of laesae majestatis, but to expel.
No, sorry, it was said that he said Zoe had done this crime.
Yes,
and then,
but the crime that of laesae majestatis that he has done, it was to expel Zoe. This was the biggest crime, because the legitimation came from Zoe. Kalliopi could not do anything without Zoe, because she was the legitimate emperor, if we can say. And she did not govern. She preferred to get married, so she got married with Agios, then with Michael, then she had the nephew, and like a son, and so on, and he became emperor by her authority.
Exactly.
This is a crime of laesae majestatis, and that's why Theodora ordered to be blinded both uncle and nephew.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, excuse my voice. No, I would stress the fact that blinding was, or we can see that blinding in the Byzantine emperors, there were always some waves of blinding. Above all, in the 10th and 11th century, when the big families goes against, and every of the big families would came to the throne. There's a dynastical problem. Then, with when the big dynasties began, the Comnines and above all the Paleologs, there wasn't necessary in such a rich manner the blinding. And so we have in the 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, the blinding didn't exist. The blinding, you stressed it, was not fixed in the legislation. The blinding was always the will of certain persons or the emperor. And we see, I think, you are a jurist, I'm not, we see the Byzantine emperor too much under a legal point of view, but outside was always the authority of the emperor or other persons. These are two big lines, and only in the last centuries, and you will speak today about a little bit about the last centuries. In the last centuries, we have quite only one line, the line of the dynasty, and so we blinding or other punishments of this kind wasn't necessary.
Thank you very much. That's why the exams were of the mid-Byzantine period, because at that time we have most of the blindnesses. After the 13th century, little by little, it went out. But in the mid-century, when we have also the big Byzantine Empire, we have this kind of blindness as a penalty. And of course, I have spoken as a jurist according to the laws, and only the exams are from the historians, because I know that the official texts are the legal texts. That's why I stressed all the legal texts, and I stressed also the legal texts about the church and so on, because we have many examples for the interfering of the church or of the state to the church in this kind of crimes. But I think that it is not my field as a jurist.
Yes, but sorry for talking again, but this is really a very interesting parallel you've given now, because we've mentioned yesterday about the medical literature. All the examples we brought are from chronicles, from hagiographical texts, from texts not being settled in this special literature. And I think it's exactly the same with the examples from the legal processes you've given. There are so many examples given in the chronicles, in historical texts, and not in this special literature. And this, I think, it's amazing. It's an amazing fact, because we also knew about this health problems of the Emperor Justine II, when from chronicles, and also we know from chronicles that the physicians had to take over the operations knife out of the hands of the emperor, because this is exactly the problem you've mentioned. It would have been a kind of amputation, and this is not allowed with the emperor, and this is not possible. But it came, in fact, it came after this big operation. It was a kind of prostate cancer. It came to a kind of castration, and there it was the problem. But we have no impact in the medical literature, and I'm not sure whether there's any impact of this process or anything in the legal literature. Do you know any examples?
No, I don't know. All the exams are from the literary sources, because from the literary sources we can understand how low penalties were applied in practice. The only thing we know from the literary sources is that blindness should be ordered by the emperor. That is, it was not, or the court, the imperial court. It was not an official who would say, or anybody, do this or that to the rebel, or it was only because it was something extra from the law. That's my explanation. I don't know if it was like that, of course. And for blindness, you said, we said yesterday, I think, about Lampsidis text. It's an old one, but very, very well done. And so we know many things about how was done blindness, semi-blindness, and so on. It's a book very, very useful about that. About castration, we have the dissertation of our young colleague, and so we shall have many things to learn when it will be over-published, yes.
One question more. Do we have any theoretical explanation why blindness was the punishment and why the blindness was disqualification for the rule? Of course, it was because a blind person, we could hardly imagine that he could be a good ruler. But was there any philosophy, let's say so, behind this kind of punishment? In terms that if a person does not respect the sacred authority of the emperor, which is visible, or etc., etc.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know what was the philosophical background. Perhaps the Persians can give to us an answer, because they had this culture of blindness. But a blind person, it is sure that at that time could not do anything. Whereas to cut his leg or to cut his arm, he could rule. But the blind could not rule, could not go to everyday acts. He could do nothing. Pardon?
A blinded person couldn't sign the acts. And this was the main duty of the
everyday authority. He could not.
No, nothing.
Whereas another mutilation was not so bad, and he could become emperor, perhaps. But I think that the Persians will give the answer to your philosophical problem.
We had Professor Dimopoulos.
Actually, my question was anticipated by Professor Privatis and Scheiner. I wanted to ask exactly what is, if we have any ideological background for this so-called penalty. We could consider it a kind of customary law of blinding the pretenders to the throne. And I had read, I think somewhere that it's the emperor had to be a representation of God on earth, therefore he could not be handicapped. And I think that what you have just mentioned, the fact that he could not sign the official acts, the laesae and all that, it's important. And just a comment that here, listening to you, I was thinking that it's a bit of a tragic irony that finally Byzantium will come almost to an end by the First Crusade that was led by an almost blind doge of the Venetian Republic, Enrico Dandolo, who was not blinded, but he was naturally blind, but he managed to lead a campaign and to conquer Constantinople in his 80s, being almost blind.
But we do not know if in Venice
there was not, obviously, but yeah.
Excuse me. An answer to Professor Perivatovich. I know only one moral statement concerning the blinding, and this is a famous phrase in the Chronicle of Psellos, when he recount, you remember, the blinding of the emperor cousin Diogenes, that no, this blinding helps to recognize better the religious and spiritual things which came from the heaven, because he can't see the civil and normal things in the world. That's a very, very sarcastic comment and often cited. But I know no other treatise about a moral treatise or theological treatise about also in the preaches and in these texts. I have never found something. That's the only comment, and this is of course a very, very bad political comment, typical for Michael Psellos.
Yes, this is typical Psellos. That's why we cannot take as a rule. Yeah.
May I also say something to Professor Period, to all of us? I understand that binding is a Persian custom, or that it entered Byzantium through the Persian connection. However, if we look at the verb oida, the very well-known Greek verb, which means I saw something, therefore I know it. It's eidein, the same verb. The word idea, of course, comes from that verb as well. Something that I saw, is that what I know? Therefore, I cannot know had I not seen it. And that is perhaps one of the possible explanations why, theoretically, blinding or seeing is one of the prerequisites for being a ruler.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you from my side as well for this very thorough presentation with lots of examples. I liked it very much. I wanted to go back to Romanos IV, Diogenes, because did I say Constantine? Oh, Romanos, sorry. Because that's a very brutal blinding, and one of the things that's very controversial about it, and I had just read recently Togliatti's account of it, is that he was already a monk when he was blinded. So and then there's this debate about whether he had willingly chosen to become a monk or not. And I was just wondering, the sources that you cited, whether that's something that's ever discussed. If someone be blinded after they become a monk, if they took the monastic habit unwillingly, or is that discussed at all in your material? I think of it with Romanos IV.
Listen, he could choose to become a monk after that. It was not something that she could do or did not do. It was, Diogenes had nothing else to do. To go where? To do what? He went to the monastery.
But Togliatti said that it was
was not anymore enough already. The small Michael was the sole emperor. So, and the very peculiar thing with Romanos Diogenes is that he was blinded by soldiers. That is, the order went from Constantinople, from the palace, perhaps to the generals. The generals did not dare to blind him. And they gave the order to some soldiers. They took him away, they blinded him, they left him there. And as Psellos says, Eleinos and so on, he went back. So what else would he do? He became a monk. And others could become monks. We have examples of blinded persons who could not become any more kings or anything, who went to the monastery.
they went to the, and that is a question also for you, they went to the monasteries because there were a hospital. Because after the blinding, it was necessary, also when the blinding was completely, there was necessary a healing in an hospital. And the most of hospitals was in, or when not a hospital, there were always, you can better tell than myself, there were always monks with a certain medical experience. And this was one of the main reasons that all persons who were blinded was sent or in a hospital in the city, that's one thing, or when outside the city, in the most cases, this was out, the blinding was outside the cities, also because the population of the cities they wouldn't hear the crying of the blinded persons. We have some relations, so it was outside, and then they was sent for some weeks or more for healing the wounds in a monastery. And this was, maybe they became also monk, maybe, but not necessary.
The Diogenes became monk, but
They became monk. Yes.
you are right, because most of the monasteries had hospitals inside, either organized, either small ones. But there was also another problem, that the families could not afford to have a blind person inside, because they had not the ways, they had not the knowledge how to be and to have this person. And of course there were no other institutions, social institutions, to put him inside and stay there and have everything, medicaments and so on. So the monastery, the big monasteries which had the hospitals, was a good solution. It was a kind of nowadays social institutions for blind persons or persons who could not had no hands, no legs, and so on. They went either to this kind of monasteries or to some small institutions for disabled that the church also had in monasteries or elsewhere.
Of course, we know about monasteries, about caring institutions, providing some kind of not only health care, but some kind of general care. And we know from the typical of Pantokrator that there was a kind of eye station for caring for eye diseases, but they are not specified. And we don't know from the medical sources about special care for blinded or for mutilated persons. But I think they would have done it anyway. But there is one very interesting link, because we know from hospitals, from the so-called Xenonica Biblia, we know some names like Johannes Avramius, who was a specialist in eye care, and he was traveling very often to Egypt. Maybe he also came from there because of his name. He was some kind of mixed nationality, and he provided some special eye remedies for the hospitals. And this is the only link we have with this example we've mentioned yesterday with Johannes the Seventh. But it's very interesting. It's really very interesting to continue research and to continue combined research on this field.
Because we speak only about blindness. In my article, where I analyze by the legal way the typicon of Pantokrator, I analyze all these things, not for eye clinic. There was an eye clinic, was a clinic for women, for surgery, and so on. And it was very well organized, very well organized.
Yeah, many thanks. Just a tiny comment about background of the custom of blinding the ruler. In fact, it's older than Persia. So to say, it's well known in the Neo-Assyrian Empire that it was a custom to blind defeated or rebellious ruler. But even older, as far as I know, the first attestation of this, so to say, custom came from the archive of Mari. It's let's say 18th, 17th century BC, and for the Near Eastern states, that was a sign that ruler is without God's support anymore. So he's on his own, he's not protected from heaven, so to say, so such heavy punishment can be imposed on him. So it was a sign of complete defeat. So, thank you.
If there are no more questions, thank you once again, Professor Bourdara.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now we take a short coffee break and we continue at 11 with our 7th session.